The Montana sky had turned to iron, heavy with the promise of a blizzard that would bury the Sapphire Mountains under a merciless shroud of snow. By late evening on February 3, 2025, the wind howled like a chorus of restless spirits, rattling the frost-covered windows of Lucas Bennett's isolated cabin. At 40, Lucas was a man who carried his past like a weight he could neither shed nor fully bear. A former firefighter from Missoula, he had once been known for charging into infernos to pull lives from the jaws of death. But 2 years ago, a warehouse. Fire gone catastrophically wrong had left him with a shattered knee, a heart full of guilt, and the echoes of screams he couldn't save. The fire had taken a family of 3, a mother, father, and their teenage son, despite Lucas's desperate efforts. The scars on his body were nothing compared to the ones on his soul. He'd retreated to this cabin 6 months ago, 30 miles, from the nearest town seeking silence, but finding only the relentless replay of that night. Tonight, the storm outside matched the turmoil within. Lucas sat in a worn leather chair by the fireplace, the only source of warmth in the small cedar-walled room. A half-empty mug of black coffee sat cold on the side table, next to a bottle of painkillers he resisted taking. His bad leg, propped on an ottoman, throbbed with the weather's change, the ache a constant reminder of his failure. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across his weathered face, lines etched deeper than a man his age should carry. He stared into the flames, lost in memories of sirens and smoke, when a sound pierced the storm's roar. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind's keening, a soft, insistent scratching at the back door. Lucas froze, his grip tightening. On the armrest. Living this far out, visitors were as rare as summer rain. The nearest neighbor, a reclusive trapper, was a 2-hour trek through the pines, and no one would brave a blizzard like this. The scratching came again, weaker now, followed by a low, plaintive whimper that cut through Lucas's haze like a knife. His firefighter's instincts, dormant, but never dead, stirred. He reached for the cane leaning against the chair. A necessity he loathed, and hobbled to the door, wincing as his knee protested each step. Cracking the door open, a gust of icy air blasted through, carrying snow that stung his face. There, collapsed in a drift on the porch, lay a French Bulldog, its compact body shivering violently. The dog was a pitiful sight. Skeletal, its brindle coat matted with ice, its bat-like ears crusted with frost. A frayed rope, knotted cruelly, tight around its neck, told a story of abandonment so callous it made Lucas's stomach churn. The bulldog's dark eyes, clouded with exhaustion, lifted to meet his, and in that fleeting moment Lucas saw something unmistakable, a plea, not just for survival, but for someone to care. "Jesus," Lucas muttered, his breath fogging in. The frigid air. He crouched awkwardly, ignoring the sharp pain shooting through his leg, and assessed the dog with the practiced eye of a first responder. Hypothermic, malnourished, likely injured, the bulldog was teetering on the edge of death. Its small chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular breaths, each one a fight. Lucas didn't hesitate. He scooped the dog into his arms, surprised at how little it weighed, barely more than a child's backpack. The bulldog didn't resist, its head lolling against his chest as he kicked the door shut and limped to the fire. Inside, he laid the dog on a faded quilt he dragged from the couch, placing it as close to the hearth as he dared. The bulldog's eyes fluttered, half open, as Lucas worked quickly. He grabbed towels from the bathroom, rubbing warmth into the dog's icy limbs, careful not to jostle it too much. The rope around its neck was embedded in raw, bloody skin, and Lucas's jaw clenched as he cut it away with his pocket knife, tossing the cruel tether into the fire where it hissed and curled like a dying snake. "Who does this to you?" He whispered, his voice rough with anger and something softer. Grief, perhaps, for a creature so clearly forsaken. He wrapped the bulldog in another blanket, tucking it tightly to trap heat, and fetched a shallow bowl of warm water. Dipping his fingers, he dripped a few drops onto the dog's cracked lips, watching as its tongue flicked weakly. "Come on, little guy," Lucas urged, his tone gentle but firm, the way he'd once spoken to trapped victims in burning buildings. "Stay with me." The dog's eyes met his again, and for a moment, Lucas felt an uncanny connection, as if this broken creature understood his words, not just heard them, but felt them. The clock on the mantel ticked toward 3 a.m., the storm outside growing fiercer, piling snow against the cabin's walls. Lucas didn't notice. For the first time in months, his world had narrowed to a singular purpose: keeping this dog alive. He didn't know its name, its story, or why it had chosen his door in a blizzard that could kill a man, let alone a small dog. But as he sat cross-legged on the floor, his bad leg stretched awkwardly, rubbing circulation into the bulldog's paws, Lucas felt something shift inside him. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was close. A spark, faint but stubborn, like the dog's heartbeat under his fingers. The bulldog stirred, its breathing slightly steadier, and Lucas allowed himself a small exhale of relief. The night wasn't over and the dog wasn't out of danger, but it had survived the first hour in his care. He leaned back against the couch, watching the firelight flicker across the dog's brindle coat, and realized he'd already decided to fight for it. Not because he was a hero, he'd given up that delusion long ago, but because this dog like him was still here, still fighting against all odds. And maybe, just maybe, they could fight together. The fire in Lucas Bennett's cabin burned steadily, its warmth a fragile barrier against the Montana blizzard raging outside. Snow piled high against the windows, sealing the small cedar-walled space into a cocoon of flickering light and shadow. Lucas sat on the floor beside the hearth, his bad leg stretched out awkwardly, his focus entirely on the French Bulldog he'd found collapsed on his porch. The dog, now freed from the cruel rope that had choked its neck, lay cocooned in a quilt, its small body still trembling despite the blankets Lucas had layered around it. He hadn't named the dog yet. Naming felt like a commitment, and Lucas wasn't sure he was ready for that. But as he watched its shallow breaths, he knew he couldn't let it slip away. The clock on the mantel read 4:12 a.m., but time felt irrelevant. Lucas hadn't slept, hadn't even considered it. His world had narrowed to the rhythm of the dog's breathing, each faint rise and fall of its chest a small victory. He leaned forward, dipping his fingers into a bowl of warm water, and carefully dripping more onto the bulldog's lips. This time its tongue moved with a touch more strength, lapping weakly before its head sank back into the quilt. "That's it," Lucas murmured, his voice low and steady, the way he'd once calmed a panicked child during a house fire. "You're tougher than you look." He reached for a clean cloth, gently wiping crusted ice from the dog's bat-like ears, and assessed its condition again. The raw wounds around its neck were angry, red, and likely infected. The skin peeled back where the rope had bitten deep. Its paws were swollen, possibly frostbitten, and its ribs protruded sharply under the matted brindle coat. Lucas's years as a firefighter had taught him to triage on instinct, and he knew this dog was in a fight for its life. Hypothermia, dehydration, starvation, anyone could kill it. Together they were a death sentence unless he acted fast. Ignoring the ache in his knee, Lucas shuffled to the kitchen, his cane thumping softly against the hardwood. He rummaged through his sparse pantry, finding a can of chicken broth. He warmed it on the stove, diluting it heavily with water to make it gentle on the dog's stomach. As the broth heated, he glanced back at the bulldog, half expecting it to be gone, a fleeting ghost of the storm. But it was still there, its dark eyes half open, watching him with a quiet intensity that made Lucas's chest tighten. He hadn't been watched like that in years, not since the fire, when his crew had looked to him for answers he couldn't give. Back by the fire, Lucas knelt with a small syringe he'd found in his old first aid kit, a relic from his firefighting days. He drew up a tiny amount of the warm broth and eased it into the dog's mouth, careful not to overwhelm it. The bulldog swallowed, its throat working faintly, and Lucas felt a surge of relief so sharp it startled him. "Good," he said, more to himself than the dog. "We'll keep at it." He settled closer, his hands moving methodically, rubbing warmth into the dog's limbs, checking its pulse, weak but steady. The familiar urgency of saving a life, one he'd thought buried with his career, pulsed through him. As the hours crept toward dawn, Lucas found himself talking to the dog, his voice filling the silence of the cabin. "I don't know where you came from," he said, cleaning the neck wounds with a damp cloth, wincing at the raw flesh. "But you didn't deserve this. Nobody does." The words felt heavy, weighted with his own unspoken pain. He hadn't talked about the fire to anyone, not his old crew, not the therapist he'd seen once and never called again. But here, with this dying dog who couldn't judge him, the words spilled out. "There was a family," he said, his voice cracking. "A mom, a dad, their kid. I was supposed to get them out. I tried, God, I tried. But the roof came down. I couldn't." He stopped, his throat tight, and focused on the dog, brushing. A thumb gently over its wrinkled forehead. Its eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, stayed on him, steady and unblinking, as if it understood. Lucas shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "You're a better listener than I deserve." The dog stirred, shifting slightly in the quilt, and Lucas froze, afraid it was a sign of distress. But the bulldog only pressed its head closer to his hand, the gesture so small yet so deliberate it stole his breath. For the first time in 2 years, Lucas felt the weight of another being's trust, not the blind faith of a victim in a fire, but something quieter, more profound. Tears pricked his eyes and he let them fall, unashamed in the privacy of his cabin. "We're a pair, aren't we?" he whispered, both half dead, still fighting. Outside, the blizzard screamed, but inside, a fragile alliance was forming. Lucas stayed by the dog's side, feeding it tiny amounts of broth every half hour, massaging its paws to coax blood flow. By 6 a.m., the storm's ferocity began to wane, though snow still blocked any hope of reaching town. The dog's breathing had deepened slightly, its heartbeat less erratic. Lucas leaned back against the hearth, exhaustion tugging at him, but he refused to close his eyes. Not yet. Not until he was sure. The first rays of dawn crept through the frosted windows, painting the room in pale gold. The bulldog, still frail but alive, lifted its head an inch, its nose twitching toward Lucas. He smiled, weary but genuine, and rested a hand on its side. "You made it through the night," he said softly. "Now let's see about the day." He didn't know what lay ahead, vet visits, recovery, the question of where this dog belonged, but for now, it was enough that they'd both survived. A dark. The Montana blizzard had finally spent itself, leaving Lucas Bennett's cabin buried under a glistening blanket of snow that muffled the world outside. Inside, the fire still burned low, casting a warm glow over the French Bulldog, nestled in a quilt by the hearth. Lucas had named the dog Bruno the previous morning, inspired by the stubborn strength in its small, battered frame, a nod to a firefighter friend who'd never backed down from a fight. 3 days had passed since Bruno's desperate arrival, and though the bulldog was far from recovered, he'd survived against odds that would have broken most. Lucas, too, felt a shift, as if the act of saving Bruno had cracked open a door he'd long kept locked. Lucas sat on the floor beside Bruno, a steaming mug of coffee in one hand, his cane resting against the couch. His knee ached less today, perhaps from the adrenaline of purpose, though he'd never admit it. Bruno's condition remained precarious, severely dehydrated, malnourished, with raw wounds circling his neck and paws tender from frostbite. Lucas had spent the first day coaxing tiny amounts of diluted broth into him, cleaning his injuries with antiseptic from his old first aid kit, and fashioning makeshift bandages from torn dish towels. The vet was unreachable until the roads cleared, likely tomorrow, so Lucas relied on instincts honed during years of emergency calls, treating Bruno like a patient who couldn't afford his mistakes. Bruno's dark eyes followed Lucas's every move, their soulful depth unsettling in their clarity. The bulldog was too weak to stand for long, but when Lucas rose to stoke the fire or grab more water, Bruno would lift his head, tracking him with a quiet intensity. "You're supposed to rest," Lucas said, half smiling as he returned to Bruno's side with a bowl of warm water. He dribbled a few drops onto Bruno's lips, and the dog lapped slowly, his tongue stronger than yesterday. Lucas nodded, a small victory settling in his chest. "That's my guy." The cabin, once a tomb of silence where Lucas had nursed his guilt, began to feel different with Bruno in it. The dog's presence demanded routine, feeding every few hours, checking wounds, monitoring his breathing. Lucas found himself waking before dawn, not from nightmares but to ensure Bruno had water. He'd catch himself talking to the dog, filling the quiet with stories he hadn't told anyone. "I used to love the job," he said one afternoon, sitting cross-legged beside Bruno, cleaning the neck wounds with a gentleness that surprised him. "Running into a fire, knowing you're someone's last hope, it's a high nothing else touches, until it goes wrong." Bruno's eyes met, his unblinking, and Lucas swore the dog understood, his wrinkled face a map of quiet empathy. That evening, as Lucas struggled to stand, his knee buckling under him, Bruno did something unexpected. The bulldog, barely able to hobble himself, dragged his body closer and pressed his warm, compact frame against Lucas's leg, as if offering support. Lucas froze, his throat tightening. He rested a hand on Bruno's head, feeling the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing. "You're gonna make me soft, you know that?" he said, his voice rough but warm. The gesture lingered in his mind, a reminder of connection he hadn't realized he'd been starving for. By the third day, Bruno could lift his head for longer, even managing a wobbly step toward Lucas when he sat too far away. The dog's trust was disarming. Despite the pain of his wounds, he never flinched from Lucas's touch. When Lucas applied antiseptic, Bruno only watched, his eyes steady, as if he knew the hurt was meant to heal. Lucas, in turn, found himself opening up more. "I don't sleep much," he admitted late one night. "The fire reduced to embers. Every time I close my eyes, I see that fire, hear them calling for me. I failed them, Bruno." The dog shifted closer, resting his chin on Lucas's knee, and for the first time in years, Lucas felt the weight of his confession lighten, shared with a creature who asked nothing, but gave everything. The next morning the sun broke through, melting the snow enough to suggest the roads might open soon. Lucas checked Bruno's pulse, steadier now, and decided it was time to risk a trip to town. He bundled Bruno in a clean blanket, carrying him to the couch to keep him off the cold floor. As he moved to grab his coat, Bruno whimpered, a soft, anxious sound that stopped Lucas cold. He knelt beside the dog, stroking his wrinkled forehead. "I'm not leaving you," he promised. "We're in this together." Bruno's eyes softened, and he nudged Lucas's hand, a gesture so trusting it made Lucas's chest ache. He sat back, watching Bruno breathe, and realized something had changed. The cabin no longer felt like a prison. Bruno's presence, his quiet resilience, his unwavering gaze, had brought life to a place Lucas had come to die in. He didn't know if Bruno had a home to return to, or if anyone was searching for him. Part of him hoped no one was, a selfish thought he didn't voice. For now, Bruno was his and he was Bruno's, two survivors tethered by a storm and a shared need to keep going. As Lucas prepared for the eventual trip to the vet, he caught himself humming, an old habit from happier days. Bruno's ears twitched at the sound and Lucas laughed, the noise foreign but welcome. "Your trouble," he told the dog, scratching behind his ears, "but the good kind." The road to town would bring answers, but for now Lucas was content to sit with Bruno, their bond growing stronger with each shared moment, a lifeline. Neither had expected, but both desperately needed. The Montana sun rose sharp and clear, cutting through the lingering chill of the blizzard's aftermath. Lucas Bennett's cabin, no longer a silent refuge for his grief, hummed with a quiet energy as he prepared for the day. The snow had melted enough to make the roads passable, and Lucas knew it was time to get Bruno, the French Bulldog who'd stumbled into his life, to a vet. 4 days had passed since he'd found the dog half dead on his porch, and though Bruno's strength was returning, his steps steadier, his eyes brighter, the bulldog still carried the scars of his ordeal. Lucas too felt a change, a flicker of purpose that had begun to thaw the ice around his heart, but he wasn't ready to name it yet. He knelt beside Bruno, who lay on a makeshift bed of blankets near the fire, and checked the bandages on his neck. The wounds were healing, less angry now, though the raw skin beneath told a story Lucas couldn't unsee. Bruno's dark eyes followed him, calm but alert, as if sensing the shift in routine. "We're going to town," Lucas said, his voice gentle but firm, the way he'd once reassured a stranded hiker. "Gotta get you fixed up proper." Bruno tilted his head, his bat-like ears twitching, and Lucas couldn't help but smile. The dog's personality, stubborn, soulful, and quietly watchful, was emerging, a mirror to Lucas's own guarded resilience. Loading Bruno into his old pickup truck was no small feat. Lucas's knee protested as he lifted the dog, still light, from malnourishment, and settled him on a folded quilt in the passenger seat. Bruno's anxiety was palpable. His compact body tensed, his eyes darting to Lucas for reassurance. "Easy, buddy," Lucas said, resting a hand on Bruno's back. "I'm right here." The dog relaxed slightly, pressing closer to Lucas's side as the truck rumbled down the snow-packed road toward Elkwood, the nearest town with a vet. Lucas glanced at Bruno, struck by how natural it felt to have him there, a companion in a truck that had carried only silence for months. At Elkwood Veterinary Clinic, Dr. Elena Torres greeted them with a warm smile and sharp eyes that missed nothing. A woman in her late 30s, she had a no-nonsense air softened by a genuine love for animals. As she examined Bruno, Lucas recounted the night of the storm, his voice tight with anger as he described the rope and the dog's condition. Elena's frown deepened as she palpated Bruno's shoulder, finding an old scar hidden under his brindle coat. "Severe malnourishment, frostbite on the paws, and this wound's from something sharp, maybe a stick or wire he got caught on," she said, her tone clinical but laced with empathy. "The rope burns suggest he was tied up, likely for weeks. He's lucky he found you when he did." Lucas nodded, his jaw clenched. "Any chance someone's looking for him?" he asked, dreading the answer. Eleanor shook her head. "No collar, no chip, and I've heard nothing about a missing bulldog. People abandon dogs out here more than you'd think." She paused, watching. Bruno leaned into Lucas's hand as he scratched behind his ears. "He trusts you, though. That's rare for a dog who's been through this much." Her words landed heavily, stirring something in Lucas he wasn't ready to unpack. A sense that Bruno's arrival wasn't random, that their brokenness had drawn them together. As they left with antibiotics, special food, and a plan for Bruno's recovery, Elena said something that lingered. "You've got a knack for this, Lucas. Ever thought about working with dogs? Bruno's got a gift, calm, intuitive. With your background, you two could do some good." Lucas brushed it off with a polite nod, but the idea stuck like a burr. Back at the cabin, he watched Bruno eat his first full meal with cautious enthusiasm, his tail giving a faint wag. Lucas sat nearby, his cane forgotten for once, and felt a spark of possibility. He'd saved lives before, but maybe saving Bruno was showing him how to live again. That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. Elena's words echoed, mingling with memories of his firefighting days, moments when he'd felt alive, needed. So on impulse, he pulled out his laptop, something he rarely touched, and searched for therapy dog programs. Bruno, sensing the shift, hobbled over and rested his head on Lucas's knee, his warmth grounding. Lucas scrolled through websites, reading about dogs trained to comfort trauma survivors. Their handlers often people who'd faced their own battles. He glanced at Bruno, who met his gaze with that uncanny understanding. "What do you think?" Lucas asked, half joking. "You up for something like that?" Bruno's tail thumped once, and Lucas laughed, the sound startling in its ease. Over the next few days, Lucas began small experiments. He'd hum or tap his foot, watching Bruno's reactions, noting how the dog seemed to sense his mood shifts, calming when Lucas tensed, nudging closer during quiet moments. One morning, when a sharp pain in his knee forced Lucas to sit abruptly, Bruno pressed against him, steady as a rock. Lucas's breath caught, not from pain, but from the realization that Bruno was already doing what therapy dogs did, offering comfort without being asked. He called Elena, his voice hesitant but curious. "You mentioned training. Where would I even start?" She didn't hesitate, sending him contacts for a program in Missoula starting next month. As Lucas hung up, he looked at Bruno, now curled by the fire, his breathing even and deep. The dog had come to him broken, yet here he was, healing and giving Lucas a reason to do the same. Enrolling in the program felt like a leap. His leg, his guilt, his fear of failing again loomed large, but Bruno's quiet trust made it seem possible. The cabin, once a place to hide, was becoming a starting point for something new, something neither could have found alone. Spring painted the sapphire mountains in vibrant hues, wildflowers bursting through the thawing earth as Lucas Bennett and Bruno, the French Bulldog who'd changed his life, stood at a crossroads neither could have imagined 5 months ago. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude where Lucas had retreated to escape his past, now buzzed with purpose. Bruno, fully recovered from his harrowing arrival in the blizzard, was a picture of health. His brindle coat glossy, his compact frame filled out, his soulful eyes bright with quiet confidence. Lucas, too, had transformed. His limp was less pronounced, softened by months of purposeful movement, and the weight of guilt that had once defined him had eased, replaced by a tentative hope rooted in the bond he shared with Bruno. The past weeks had been a whirlwind. Lucas had enrolled them in a therapy dog training program in Missoula, a decision that felt like stepping into a fire he wasn't sure he could face. But Bruno's uncanny empathy, his ability to sense distress and offer comfort, made every grueling session worthwhile. The Bulldog had a gift, zeroing in on people's unspoken pain with a nudge or a steady lean, his wrinkled face a beacon of calm. Lucas, drawing on his firefighter's instincts and his own scars, found he could guide Bruno while connecting with others in ways he'd thought lost forever. They'd graduated 2 weeks ago, their certification a quiet triumph, marked by a photo of Bruno in a therapy vest, his tail a blur of pride. Their first assignment came unexpectedly, a call from the county sheriff's office. A child, a 7-year-old girl named Sophie, had gone missing during a family hike near Blacktail Canyon. Though search teams were combing the woods, the family waited at base camp, frayed with fear. Lucas and Bruno were asked to provide support, a test of their training in a real crisis. As Lucas drove to the trailhead, memories of the warehouse, fire surfaced, screams, smoke, his failure to save the family. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, breath shallow, until Bruno's paw rested on his arm, their signal for calm. Lucas exhaled, grounding himself in the dog's steady gaze. "All right, partner," he said. "Let's do this." At the base camp, tension hung thick as fog. Sophie's parents paced, their faces etched with dread, while her older brother sat silent, staring at the ground. Lucas introduced himself, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest, and Bruno went to work. The Bulldog approached Sophie's mother first, pressing his warm body against her leg. She knelt, tears spilling as she buried her face in his. First, and Bruno stayed, unmoving until her sobs slowed. Lucas watched, marveling at Bruno's instinct, and began talking with the father, offering updates with the calm assurance he'd once used on panicked victims. When Sophie's brother withdrew further, Bruno nudged his hand, coaxing a faint smile, the first crack in the boy's fear. Near dusk, radios crackled with news. Sophie was found, cold but unharmed, tangled in brush a mile away. As the search team brought her down, Bruno's ears perked, his body alert but calm, as if he'd sensed her return before the others. Sophie, shivering and overwhelmed, flinched from the crowd, until Bruno approached. He sat quietly beside her, his presence a soft anchor, and she reached for him, her small hands clutching his fur as she whispered, "Good dog." Lucas's throat tightened, not just for Sophie's safety, but for the way Bruno had become exactly what she needed, a bridge back to the world. Driving home under a starlit sky, Lucas felt a peace he hadn't known since before the fire. Nightmares still came and his knee would always ache, but they no longer defined him. Bruno, curled in the passenger seat, had shown him that brokenness could be a foundation, not a sentence. Back at the cabin, Lucas acted on an idea that had been growing. He contacted Elena Torres, the vet who'd first seen Bruno's potential, and outlined a plan. A small training center at his cabin for rescue dogs and handlers focused on therapy work for crisis survivors. Elena's enthusiasm was immediate, and by summer the first sessions were underway. Bruno, the unofficial mascot, greeting each new dog with a wagging tail. One evening, as Lucas and Bruno sat on their favorite hill overlooking the valley, the mountains glowing purple in the fading light, Lucas reflected on their journey. Letters from families they'd helped, Sophie's included, lined the cabin walls, each one a testament to Bruno's gift and their shared purpose. "You know, Lucas said, scratching Bruno's ears. "Everyone thinks I saved you that night." "But you saved me, didn't you?" Bruno's eyes met his, warm and knowing, and his tail thumped against the grass, a silent agreement. An email from Eleanor arrived later, a news clip about a dog-fighting ring busted in Idaho. Records suggested a French Bulldog matching Bruno's description had been discarded for being too gentle, escaping during transport months before the blizzard. Lucas looked at Bruno, now sprawled contentedly by the fire, and felt a surge of gratitude. That rejection had led Bruno to his door, turning their wounds into a legacy of healing. "Too gentle," Lucas murmured, smiling. "Their loss, our gain." As summer unfolded, Lucas and Bruno's work grew, their story spreading quietly. A man and a dog, both abandoned in their own way, who'd found each other and built something extraordinary. The cabin, once a place to hide, was now a beacon, proof that the deepest scars can lead to the greatest purpose, and that sometimes the smallest souls leave the biggest marks.